Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review of the Ridgid number 345 pipe and tubing double flaring tool. This is a pretty nice flaring tool. It gets some pretty darn good reviews online, although it is pretty expensive. The average retail new price on this flaring tool is about $75, so it's a lot more expensive than more mundane flaring tools, such as this performance tool, which runs you, what, $15, $20. Now, there's some distinct advantages to this Ridgid flaring tool, and I just wanted to show you guys that. For some reason, I couldn't find any of my soft tubing, but there is a variety of videos showing how to flare tubes, and it's actually pretty easy. I'll describe it. And this one works pretty well just because of how much more secure it holds on to the fitting bar or the tubing bar. And let's just go ahead and get into it. This is the tubing bar. So what these are is you don't clamp, say, the flare fitting. These are actually designed for you to take the tube and just clamp the tube into it. And so that's what the texturing is on the inside of these, is just to hold the tube. Every once in a while, people have some issues with the tube slipping as you're applying pressure to do the flaring operations, and this Ridgid's been pretty good. And anytime I've ever had a problem, it's because I had some kind of particle or dirt in between the halves, and they just weren't able to get close enough. And that's another little trick to these, is if they ever start to wear out on you, you can easily, and even the older style ones like this with the beam type, you can pull the two halves apart and just run them a sharpening stone, something really flat, against the inside of the two halves, and then they'll close just a little bit tighter, and then the tubing won't slip. Now, if we compare this would be the traditional style. The performance tool uses a couple nuts, but for decades they've been like this with the wing nuts, where you just put the tube in, you tighten one side, then you tighten the other, and you may hold this with a vise or something to try to keep it tight, or even vise it right in the middle. And the Ridgid's a little bit more convenient because the block holds, or the driver holds so well onto the block that you just don't have the same types of issues. So one obvious difference is, even though they're about the same width, obviously the thickness of this Ridgid unit is nearly twice as much. No, I wouldn't say twice as much. 35% thicker. Yeah, about 35% thicker. So this is a really nice heavy-duty bar. And because of the design, you don't have these weird wing nuts that you're having to use screwdrivers to tighten down to get enough friction. This really works in an entirely different and much, arguably, more intelligent fashion. You have down here, there is this lock rod, it's threaded, that has a rounded, and you can see that it's rounded and it fits into these little rounds. So when you slide this in here, you'd find whatever position that you needed, and then you just go ahead and start to tighten down the lock rod. And one thing you would want to do is to make sure that's really rigid. Sometimes a little ball in the lock rod will get a little bit jammed up, or a little bit of friction just right on the side, so you really want to make sure this is nice and centered. And then when you tighten down the lock rod, the one thing that's really nice is the fact that it's tightening down directly over the top of the specific fitting that you're using. So rather than relying on the clamping being on each end of a beam and then having the middle of this wanting to bow out a little bit or slightly, on this, you're clamping down right over the top of the pipe, so it doesn't matter what's going on in either end of the beam. And this has really made this type of unit quite successful for me. You're able to clamp on really nicely. It's pretty easy to find it, the centering position, which is more difficult on this style and the performance tool style here, because you have to slide it back and forth, and you have to draw down the little anvil here to make sure it mates up right to the end of the little dies to make sure it's well centered. And on this, it's just a whole lot easier with the divots and this, and it also prevents it from wanting to slide back and forth. So I thought that was one of the major design differences. Another design difference is, of course, the clamp itself, or the flaring. I don't even know what they call it. I wouldn't call it the anvil, but it may be the anvil. We can see how heavy duty this is. If we pull out this performance tool and put it over the top, we can see that the forging is just huge. Actually, this performance tool may not even be forged, but this Ridgid is forged. You can see that due to the evidence of the heavy flashing that they had to grind off. That's thick flashing that indicates that it's forged. So it's much heavier duty. It's a much more rigid unit. And because you're relying on this side screw to apply a lot of clamping force, it's one of the reasons why it's just so thick and so heavy duty. They have this heavy duty cup that goes down that anvil recesses into, just so it has more strength down lower on these two legs, so they don't want to spread apart when you're putting a lot of clamping force on this side nut. So that's one big difference, and one of the reasons it actually works so well is just because of that fact. So this is just really heavy duty. The other nice aspect is that it is 7 sizes from 3/16 through 5/8, so it'll cover most of the sizes that you need. Now, as far as flaring tubing, it's actually really pretty easy. You just, whatever size that you're using, say you're using a 1/2 inch, you do need these. If you do not have the little dies, you'll not be able to operate a flaring tool. And that's one thing to keep an eye out for. Oftentimes the beams and the clamps will show up in various tool bins at garage sales, but inevitably these little dies always end up getting lost. And these are critical. These would allow you to do a double flare versus a single flare. A single flare is just this, where you put the tube in, you clamp it down to where the tube end would be flush with where the side that has the bevels on it. You just clamp it down where it's flush. And you would do this, say, with copper tubing. You would just do a single flare, and then when you put this on and run the little cone down onto it, it just does a single flare, which just spreads out the end like that. A double flare is just a little bit different, where you take the die, I don't even think this will fit, and when you use these special dies, you would put the die in the end of the tube, and the little trick to using these dies, and in many of the other videos about pipe flaring show, is that the trick is that the little flange or the shelf that's on it is actually a measuring tool. So you'd want to raise it up till it's flush with the bottom of that. And these Ridgid are actually pretty grippy. So you measure it up like that. And then you put this in. This would be the first step. So when you use this device, and it has a little divot to keep it aligned, is that you would use this over the top, and you would screw down all the way until this die ends up drawing flush to the surface of the metal bar. And what that does is the die kind of prevents the center from collapsing in, and then it hits this little cup here, and it can't really flare out or in. And so what it does is it kind of crushes it down and crimps it out, so it kind of forms a bulge. It makes it have a ring with a bulge around the edge, known as ballooning. And then you would actually remove the die, and you just keep the pipe in the same position. And that's one nice thing about the Ridgid, is that it will still stay clamped while you unscrew the top part to pull out the die, and then you just run the cone back down into where the little ballooning happened, and that creates your double flare. So you have the little cone on the inside, and then the kind of rolled over edge that provides a seal. And that's essentially how these work. And the thing that makes the Ridgid so much different is it's just so heavy duty and it's easier to align, so you can spend more time focusing just making sure the tubing is in there at appropriate length, and that you're able to go slowly and get a nice accurate flare. And that's one of the biggest things about the reviews, is that this Ridgid unit really does give you nice accurate flares because of how rigid it is, and then the fact that it holds the tubing real well. Just because of its design, when you clamp it down, it's just easier to clamp it down nice and tight. You're not fiddling with screwdrivers and pry bars to try to get these to clamp down tight enough. And then it's just real thick, so it doesn't have any kind of deflection. And that's really the big deal. And if you're working with mild steel tubing and the stronger tubing versus, say, aluminum or copper or anything like that, it really starts to make a difference having one of these heavy-duty flaring tools. So anyway, there was one other little aspect which was kind of nice about it, and I don't know if it's specifically just due to this unit, but this little hinge on the back, what's nice is you can kind of get it around the tube, and then if you flip this, it'll want to prevent the two halves from coming apart. When you open it, it kind of rotates it to the other side, and they just move nice and easily. But like a switch, when you flip it, then it kind of wants to hold the two halves together, and that can be handy in a variety of different situations. One last note is they are proper, and they do stamp the size of tubing along with each little die here, so it's easier to keep track of them. And one thing to note, on these little dies, almost universally, you're using the back shelf as the measuring tool. But like this performance tool, that standard isn't universal. In this performance tool, their bright idea is that you would actually use these dies and you put them down through the hole next to it and use the lower shelf. So that's something to be aware of, is the way that these are used as measurements are based off the shelves, and sometimes they do it backwards, and that is something else to be aware of. Otherwise, I just wanted to do a quick review of this Ridgid just because it is such a nice tool and is just so much heavier duty than what would be considered just a standard run-of-the-mill kind of split beam double flaring tools, whose primary issues are it's difficult to get them tight enough so that the tubing doesn't want to slip when you're attempting to flare it. And then the second issue is it is more difficult to get the anvil to want to align right over the top of the tubing, especially in awkward situations where you may be trying to use this flaring tool on a tube that's already installed in a vehicle or a piece of equipment. And then, of course, one other nice feature is it has built-in leverage handles or built-in handles that are crimped on each end so they don't fall out. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention. There is a ton of pipe flaring videos on YouTube, but not very many about this Ridgid heavy-duty pipe flaring tool. And so I wanted to bring that to people's attentions and show them that there really are some much nicer double flaring tools made besides what would be considered the universal split beam that pretty much everybody who's used one of these is familiar with. And really, these heavier duty ones do work quite a bit better and much more consistently. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching, and please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.